we'll be opening up to questions, so feel free to get involved. Yeah, so I suppose, we're very lucky to have Paul today with us today, and I'm very excited to be able to talk about this new publication, which is the Hygienic Apparatus, Weimar Cinema and Environmental Disorder. So as you will be aware from the kind of advertising we've done for this event, it's a book which combines kind of canonical films or rereads canonical films, and also combines a more contextual analysis of urban design, architectural design, Kulturfilme, etc. But I'll let Paul go into that in a second. And just by way of introducing Paul, Paul Dobryden received his PhD in German studies from the University of California, Berkeley in 2014. In 2016, he moved to Charlottesville, where he's an assistant professor in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Virginia. He has published essays on Weimar cinema and culture in numerous anthologies and in journals such as Studies in European Cinema, Colloquia Germanica, and Modernism Modernity. His research focuses on cinema's intersections with discourses of health and environmental transformation in early 20th century Germany. So now I'll just hand over to Paul to say a little bit about the book by way of introduction.
All right, I'm going to share my screen now. All right. Thank you, Lawrence. Yeah, I want to thank Molly Harrabin and Lawrence Alexander for organizing. It was really nice to receive an email from you guys saying you wanted to talk about the book. You know, it was a lot of it was done in a very kind of isolated period, and it's it doesn't feel quite real that it's out, but it's great to be able to talk to you about it. I also should thank the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies at the Free University. I am in their space right now because my internet where I'm staying is not great, and they were generous enough to let me use their space. And just thank you everyone for coming to acknowledge the publication of this odd little book. So if you want to learn what tenement housing has to do with the interior design of movie theaters, what a film about urban traffic safety has in common with a short documentary about a retirement home, and what studies of the behavior of dust particles have to do with F.W. Murnau's Faust, then this is the book for you. So I will just start by saying a few words about the argument and the overall topic, some of the things I talk about, but hopefully not for too long. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and questions. So I think first it would help to explain a little bit about what I mean by hygiene and what it is that I'm actually talking about when I use this word that has a lot of different historical uses and connotations. So the basic argument of the book is that a kind of environmentally oriented hygiene was a really important way that people thought about environments and the link between environments and health in the early 20th century, and that this kind of hygiene helps us understand, or kind of thinking about this kind of hygiene helps us understand certain aspects of film culture in the early 20th century, in early 20th century Germany, and that looking at films that kind of intersect with hygiene in various ways can teach us something about how people thought about environments and the relationship between film and the kind of material environment of urban modernity. So what is hygiene? It's the sense in which I'm using it corresponds somewhat to what a historian, Alphonse Labisch, calls experimental hygiene, which involved thinking about the everyday spaces of urban life and trying to manage the various dirty, messy, contagious things that tended to happen there. So it was about managing what was seen as like unhealthy environmental disorder in urban everyday spaces. The historian Didem Ekachi calls it the physiology of kind of everyday spaces. She writes that the science of hygiene aimed to determine the optimal stimuli in an environment in exact figures for the organism to remain healthy. It quantified and rationalized the relationship between the body and everyday spaces according to health criteria. So to give you a sense of what this encompassed was a very capacious notion of hygiene. And I brought a page from the guide to the International Hygiene Exhibition in Dresden in 1911. And this outlines some of the kind of exhibitions you could see there, dealing with topics like air and light and soil and water, buildings, houses, ventilation, lighting, water supply, all of these sorts of things. There were lots of kind of sub-disciplines, like dealing with particular kinds of spaces, industrial hygiene, housing hygiene, street hygiene, kind of whatever space you could think of, there was a hygiene for it. And so these kinds of disciplines brought together, various kinds of science, chemistry, biology, and tried to think about how to mitigate or make urban everyday environments more healthy, so that they weren't so damaging to the people that lived and worked in them. So why is this important? So I think just generally the hygienic in all its senses is a crucial aspect of modernity. It tells us about how expertise was mobilized to manage populations and the effects of modernity on populations. Hygiene is crucial to modern ideologies of progress. It justified various forms of power, sometimes violent and coercive power. It was also a way that individuals could take up kind of modern subjectivity. People could do hygiene themselves, become kind of hygienic subjects in the way that they dealt with their own bodies and the way they interacted with their environments. And so I think that if we want to kind of understand the history of environmental thinking, given the urgency of the issue of the environment today, I think that hygiene and this kind of environmentally oriented hygiene is a really important aspect of how environments were thought about. All right, so what does this have to do with cinema? Cinema first arrived in a world where hygiene and hygienic ways of thinking were an important discourse of modernity. And I think being aware of this can help us understand things about what I'd call spatial or environmental dimensions of film culture during this period. At least I think this is true for Germany. I try to be careful about the context I'm working in, but I think some of these ideas could certainly be extended beyond this context. And so in the book, I basically try to think through various ways in which these two things encountered each other. So hygiene on the one hand and cinema on the other. It was a rather messy encounter and played out in a couple of different dimensions. So just to kind of conclude, I'll talk about kind of three different dimensions in which this encounter between cinema and hygiene happened. First, we can think about the hygiene in the space of the movie theater. The first chapter thinks about how hygiene informed how people talked about the space of the movie theater. Early visitors talking about, especially bourgeois visitors to working class theaters, talking about the kind of disease and contagion and these kinds of fears of an unhygienic space. But then hygienic ways of thinking also influenced the material design of theaters in terms of things like fire safety regulations, so very concrete sorts of things like that. And then they also inflected how modernist designers and architects talked about theaters in the 20s and tried to, in some cases, imagine what would a healthy movie-going experience look like. So here you have a couple of diagrams from an issue of a trade journal on the modern theater, and it's all about how to make, how to position the screen so that the viewers aren't straining their necks, and how to properly ventilate the theater and all these sorts of things. So how to make a hygienic movie theater. The second dimension of this encounter I talk about has to do with educational films. And so here I deal with a lot of movies that are not terribly well known, that deal with things like hygiene in the home, providing instruction to people how to properly care for their home, their kitchen, often primarily for implicitly female spectators. It also encompassed things like urban planning, kind of explaining how urban planning could make a hygienic city. But then it also encompasses things that we wouldn't necessarily think of under like environmental issues today, like traffic. So I look at a traffic safety film, and when we're thinking about environmental dangers of the modern city, traffic accidents were one that people were thinking about, and so that gets kind of fits under this rubric as well. Another dimension that I discuss are kind of fictional films that, and especially I really love the filmmaker F.W. Murnau with regard to this, fictional films that thematize both kind of narratively and aesthetically hygienic issues, just kind of broadly conceived, and in, I think, interesting ways, like resist a kind of hygienic impulse or the ways that hygiene kind of thought people should inhabit spaces or how spaces should be organized. And so I look at the ways that, for instance, in Murnau's Faust, he really fills the screen with dust and fog and smoke, all these things that hygiene was trying to clear out or control. And so Murnau is interested in kind of aesthetic resistance to the hygienic. And then finally, I look at these are some of them kind of educational in a way, but more kind of political or critical films toward the end of the Weimar Republic from a leftist perspective that took a lot of the kind of visual rhetoric of earlier hygiene-oriented Kulturfilme and reframed them into a political critique that went a bit deeper and looked at some of the kind of inadequacies of a hygienic way of thinking, and so pointing out how hygiene ultimately is not really going to solve the problems of capitalist modernity. One needs to think more deeply in order to actually do that. So I think I'll just leave it there for now, and I can hopefully explain more as we go on.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for taking us through those images. Yeah, I think I was just thinking in particular the Faust example is a really great kind of, well, is blend the right word between this like textual and contextual analysis. So not only looking at like the the visual field and for the purposes of like the narrative, but the accounts of kind of Emil Janning's cursing because he'd been essentially like blinded by smoke all day is really interesting. So I guess I'll kick off the questions. As I said, if anyone wants to write something in the chat or just wave or say anything, feel free to. I guess to begin with, it makes sense to ask how you came to this topic of environmental disorder, hygiene, etc. Yeah.
Sure. I actually came at it from just first a fascination with Weimar cinema. I've really been interested in Weimar cinema for a long time, just as a really interesting site of experimentation, where people during this period are really trying to think about what movies are, what they can do in a lot of different senses, educationally, with regard to entertainment, politically, and so on. And then second, I just have I think I could say I have a fascination with fascination. So the ways that movies are talked about in these kind of hypnotic and immersive terms during this period, the ways that people thought movies just kind of were transporting in a really strongly affective sense. And so I started to get interested in kind of discourses of attention and immersion, and the ways that films could offer different kinds of experiences of space. and kind of, in a more modern vein. And then I started then from there thinking about the kind of like apparatus of the movie theater itself. So that kind of arrangement of technology, the projector and the screen in a certain kind of space, right? The darkened theater, the slightly reclined chairs, and so on and so forth. How that kind of arrangement in space or that kind of ordering of an environment helps create a certain kind of experience. And then started to think about, okay, well, what other kinds of ways of ordering environments are people thinking about at this time, outside the cinema, and how might those sorts of things intersect, right? And so hygiene, the kind of discourse of hygiene is all about thinking about how environments are ordered, how they impact health, either positively or negatively. And you can see that kind of way of thinking about an environment in the ways that people were talking about movie theaters at that time. And then it kind of developed from there, trying to think about how this particular logic of thinking about an environment and an environmental disorder kind of plays out in different dimensions of cinema, whether it's the the theater itself, or attempts by or kind of the use of film as a medium of mass education, to kind of teach this way of thinking or kind of embody a certain way of looking at environments through film. And then finally, how, in what ways can cinema also kind of contest this, or offer a different way of experiencing environments that is kind of implicitly in dialogue with this this larger discourse.
Yeah, I guess for the benefit of the people who haven't had a chance to get their hands on a copy so far, yeah, I really like this idea that so hygiene is itself kind of an apparatus, so like one of many intersecting socio-political apparatuses, and then the filmic apparatus, as you say, is either an object or a target for those concerns around hygiene and public health, but also a vehicle for them at the same time, which I think is a really kind of nuanced argument that comes out in the course of the book. Shyamala, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that sounds like a really fascinating book, Paul, and I'm really excited to get my hands on a copy soon. My question really just comes from my own area of interest, and it would be, do you have a section or a treatment, for want of a better word, of noise or sound in your book, and like noise as pollution or infection or whatever it might mean? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that question. I would say not an extensive section. I think sound studies is probably a kind of unfortunate lacuna in both my training and my thinking, but it does certainly come up in discussions of the theater itself as a form of stimuli, right? So these modernist designers that I'm kind of looking at in the movie theater chapter are thinking about all the different things that the spectator is experiencing and how those might impact, positively or negatively, the health of or kind of experience of the spectator. And so, for instance, like they're thinking about how to, like you don't want to turn the lights down too low when the movie is not playing, because otherwise, then when the movie comes on, it'll be like very bright and kind of like hurt your eyes a little bit, right? And so they're thinking in very like fine ways about how the kind of full sensory experience of the theater is affecting the body and the kind of the body of the spectator. And this also is true with regards to kind of acoustic design of the theater as well. And you don't want to kind of like harsh bouncing of sound off of the walls that might kind of like hurt the ears of the people that are there and that sort of thing. But I think it would certainly be interesting to think about noise more as one of those characteristically urban forms of sensory pollution that in some ways, like cinema is can be a kind of respite from, right? As it's a space where that noise is maybe more controlled in the form, either in the form of silence or in the form of music, and providing a different kind of experience of the city that is not so noisy. Although it does remind me of the use of like sound effects that kind of mimic the kind of city experience in silent films as well. One could think about that.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah, we have a question from Mary in the chat. Would you like me to read or if you would like to read your own question, feel free to.
I felt shy, but I can ask my question. Congratulations, Paul. I was curious about how, I mean, obviously you've been working on this topic a while and you're an expert in it, but I'd love to hear maybe an example of how it's affected your own teaching of Weimar cinema, maybe of a particular film, and, you know, hopefully for my own future reference, you know, what from your book you think instructors who are hoping to inspire students about Weimar cinema in particular can take from this book.
Thank you. I did see it. I saw it in the chat there, and I was trying to like think about, you know, what kinds of examples can I bring up. So I have in the past taught a course on cinema and environment, and kind of like images or representations of nature. That's not necessarily just German. That goes beyond that context in a certain way. But I have in that course brought in some of the films, like especially the more political ones like Kuhle Wampe or How the Worker Lives, that are, I think, the interesting perspective examination of environmental injustice, and that resonate in important ways with the present. I think they show like how long. Or people think of environmentalism as a kind of, you know, like especially like post-World War II, you know, social movement starting in the 70s and 80s. But this goes, you know, this kind of thinking, even though it wasn't done in the same terms, goes back much farther, and I think that can help. Making those connections can help make the films of this period a little more present and seem just a little more like alive, right? And in that course, I also connected it to later films on the anti-nuclear movement, for instance, and so sort of trying to establish historical continuities between more recent and older things. In terms of teaching Weimar cinema generally, I found it difficult. I might have a little chip on my shoulder about how like boring a lot of my sources are. Like these, I'm reading a lot of like, you know, trade and technical journals about like fire safety regulations and, you know, just really kind of like dry sorts of things. And it's not quite as exciting as maybe some of the other aspects of Weimar cinema that jump out at you. But I do try to integrate, you know, one or two films when I'm teaching Weimar that thematize the environments in various ways, whether it's the kind of urban environment or images of nature and these sorts of things.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think I will take the opportunity to say, well, Molly and I were saying earlier that you have synthesized that kind of archival research in a way that's like incredibly engaging for how much drudgery it may have taken to kind of go through all of that material, and they really leap off the page. I'd say some of the quotations. So there's a hand up from Jean-Paul.
Yes,
I believe. Yes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can I speak?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, I have a question related to Kuhle Wampe. There was a picture of the thinking of the girl about abortion in Kuhle Wampe, where the position of different children in the picture. My question is twofolded. The first one is playing abortion a role in the book. And as a second question, I would like to have an opinion on the scene with the naked people in Kuhle Wampe that was in the script, but was sorted out by German censorship. So what is the role of nudism, Freikörperkultur in German, in the book? And yeah, what do you think about Dudov incorporating this scene in the film? Also, it was sorted out later on because communists were not very fond of nudism. So if the film was complete now, so we would see nude communists, but this was more familiar, popular with social democrats that were more involved in the Freikörperkultur. Okay, that's okay.
Thank you. So to the first question on abortion, yes. So I as the book goes on, it becomes more and more about the relationship between bodies and environments, and how discourses of the body related to these kinds of hygienic ideas about space. And so I kind of read Ani's thinking about reproduction and the possibility of reproduction. You know, she's thinking also about her brother, right, who is kind of has no space in the order of the city as it exists, right? There's no work, and he's kind of placeless, and he commits suicide at the beginning of the film, and she sort of imagines having a child and the same thing happening to that child, and so there's this fear of kind of like, or this concern with surplus populations, and it's drawing on a rhetoric of environmental disorder as including a kind of surplus of bodies, as there are too many people, a kind of Überbevölkerung. And that, I think, in the book, I try to kind of tease out, is there a kind of fear of overpopulation in a kind of eugenic sense, or is it more a kind of Marxist discourse of surplus population? But that image I find really striking in the way it kind of like, it evokes a certain anxiety about population, and which resonates with discourses on the city as being too crowded, and the kind of environment of the city as being too crowded, and hygienic urban planning trying to deal with that in one way, and then ultimately fascism trying to deal with that in another way. With regard to the swimming scene, I don't actually discuss it in the book, but I think I would read it in terms of how I see the film kind of ironizing and critically ironizing ideas about the therapeutic aspect of nature. And so, you know, there's this kind of idea that the city is unhealthy and people need to kind of get back in touch with nature, you know, go on your Ausflug or whatever to the urban periphery in order to kind of regenerate yourself for the working week later on. And the film, I think, kind of ironizes this, especially in the context of the economic crisis at the end of the Weimar Republic, where like that kind of therapeutic idea of nature only makes sense in a working economy, right? You're only regenerating yourself if you have something to like go back to during the rest of the week. Whereas Kuhle Wampe is this kind of like place on the urban periphery that like simulates a kind of therapeutic nature, but they have nothing to go back to. It sort of has lost its point. And the people there are kind of living out these like empty scripts that don't really like get them anywhere. And that is seen in opposition to the sports festival at the end, where the young communists are also out in nature, but they're using it for a very different purpose. They're forming a new political collective, right? Which is something that is not happening when you go skinny dipping or kind of play cards out on the grass, right? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, the youth communists were part of this sports festival. So nudism was incorporated into this sport festival as a new feeling, as a new feeling, a new body feeling. That should probably liberate the workers from oppression.
I see. Yeah, I think I misunderstood that. I was unclear about the context of that scene.
It was the opening of the sport festival. So young youth and young youth boys playing with the ball on the beach, and then going to the water and swimming.
Yeah, then I would try to, I think, read it in terms of this like formation of a political collective being also implying a kind of different nature, different relationship between the body and nature.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jean-Paul. Yeah, if anyone, Irvin has raised his virtual hand, so I'll pass the floor to you.
Complicated.
Hi, Paul. Thanks so much. You said something about how Murnau has this particular, I forgot how you phrased it, like either proclivity for this type of hygienic thinking, or somehow a predisposition toward it. And I heard it as, in comparison to other iconic or canonical filmmakers of the period. So what about Murnau specifically is so incredibly hygienically oriented that perhaps doesn't register for some of the others? I love that point, and I just want to hear a little more about it. Full disclosure, I have yet to read the book because it's sitting on my desk in Vancouver.
Thank you, Irvin. It's great to see you. So Murnau, for me, I think is actually quite anti-hygienic in his conception of film. And for me, this goes back to his kind of what I call his kind of like phantasmagoric impulse. Going back to kind of phantasmagoria of the 19th century, where part of the attraction was this like apparent lack of separation between the space of the illusion and the spectator, right? There's no kind of wall separating this ghostly apparition from the people who are sitting there in the theater. And some of his movies, I think, try to kind of like evoke this lack of separation between image and spectator, or illusion and spectator. And this is like a profoundly anti-hygienic impulse. So if hygiene in a lot of ways tries to reinforce a very normative vision of the body, which is closed and whole and integrated, and is very much about keeping separate those things that can harm the body from the body. And Murnau is fascinated with moments in which these kinds of this kind of image of the body is like disrupted or punctured. You can think of Nosferatu in this context, right, as this profoundly like invasive creature who overcomes whatever separations that are put in front of him, whether it's the skin or the kind of geographical distance between his castle and Hutter's city, right? But this plays out in similar ways in Faust, I would say, but there he's very much interested in the ways that, like, just as from a kind of aesthetic perspective, blurring the boundaries of the body with these very like diaphanous materials like smoke and fog, such that it becomes like the boundaries that separate like the environment from the figure on the screen become very fluid. And there's like something very, very kind of anti-hygienic about this. I mean, this has a kind of double edge, like as I think Lawrence mentioned, he was filling the film studio with smoke, right? The studio could be thought of as, like, in principle, a kind of hygienic technology. They were built on the edges of cities, right, where the environment could be more controlled to, like, keep out the noise and dust of the city. But Murnau kind of turns that around and just fills it with smoke and fog. And Jannings and in particular complained about, like, how awful it was to, like, be subjected to this, like, smoky environment the entire for, you know, for, like, a lot of the shoots. And so he develops a kind of anti-hygienic aesthetics. And then I discussed the last laugh in a different chapter where that plays out in a different way with regard to the mobile camera. Yeah.
Yeah, if no one has any other questions, just bring to mind, I kind of have a couple that follow on from those 2 points. The first would be whether there are any other, how exceptional do you think Faust is in that kind of disposition of fog and smoke? Because that's the main focus of that particular chapter, and I guess mainly because of this kind of anecdotal image of people's eyes streaming because they've been kind of like fogged. I wonder whether any other kind of contenders that you could have included in that chapter. The reading of the beginning of Faust reminded me a little bit of the train crash in Alexander, with this kind of like searchlight smoke kind of, it's a similar image, I guess, which I suppose would have also been in the studio, but I wonder whether there's any others. If that's not too banal a question.
No, yeah, I mean, I think it's exceptional in its kind of like extended meditation on the movements of particulate matter. Like, it's just really throughout the entire thing. But I'd say, like, it does draw on a quite common cinematic attraction, which is like explosions and fire and smoke and like things that kind of burn and change and move in kind of unpredictable ways. And so, like, part of thinking about studio environments, for instance, was like, how do we control explosions? How do we, like, make smoke that is not too dangerous for the people around it, right? Because it is an attraction. And so that's something that, you know, it appears in a lot of different kinds. You could think of Metropolis and the kind of like explosions that happen in Metropolis, but also this like aesthetic of Stimmung that Balázs talks about, like a smoke and fog as a kind of atmospheric element that gets used in a lot of different ways. But I think the intensity with which it happens in Faust like draws attention to certain certain interesting, maybe hygienic problems that maybe you wouldn't think about normally. And like that, you know, that contradiction on the one hand between like, we want to get these great images of smoke versus how awful it is for the actors. That was also a consideration with like light. The light used in the studio in order to produce bright images can be very bright and damaging to the eyes, or like hard for the eyes to take. And so the actors like sometimes will like wear sunglasses between takes and stuff like that in order to protect their eyes from the lighting used in studios. And so you can see this kind of contradiction between like people hygiene on the one hand and like the hygiene of the image on the other, right? There's this like way that they're trying to they need to like organize the environment in order to produce a certain kind of image. And that in some ways like works against or like contradicts what you would call like a healthy working space. And so you know, that's a more general dynamic that like I think we can see in filmmaking, more generally.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Mary has her hand up. I guess just on the point of the Faust example, you also mentioned the Black Imp in the Méliès film, where that's like this idea of a special effect, which uses smoke in order to disguise it, turning the camera off and on. Would have been the effect to the spectator is so different to that which obviously the kind of pro-filmic people would have experienced, which is another kind of nuance, I suppose. Sorry, Mary, please go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. Just in hearing you answer some questions, the topic of work and labor has come up a few different times. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit about kind of the status of work or working conditions in the book.
Sure. So just generally, I would say like hygiene has this very productivity-centered notion of health, that it's not just sort of creating healthy environments for their own sake, but for enabling kind of productivity, work productivity and efficiency and that sort of thing. And so there's this kind of like argument that it's not just good for people, but that it's something that will make things run better, just make modernity kind of run better. And so that kind of is a background that is like always present in discourses of hygiene, this like idealization of the working and laboring body. And that then can be pursued in a few different directions. One direction I pursue it is in the kind of representation of disability and sort of bodies that like non-normative bodies that like challenge that idea of a kind of ideal able body. And so for instance, in the traffic safety film that I look at, these kinds of films in staging environments and what like showing you what constitutes an ordered environment, they're forced to also stage kind of like who those environments are implicitly for, right? And what kinds of bodies are privileged in them. So, when you're looking at representations of like proper traffic safety, it's like children should not be playing in the street, right? Like they don't fit there. It's not for them, right? It's for people who are going to work. Or there's like a kind of comic episode in which like an older man from the country goes to Potsdamer Platz and is like totally overwhelmed, and he moves too slowly for the people there, right? And so it's not for him either, right? So there's a certain kind of like normal idea of a normal able body that is privileged in this kind of environment, and is like that's who the environment is designed for. And so in the fourth chapter, I look at films that deal with non-normative bodies, bodies that kind of like are a problem for this vision of hygienic order. And that includes both educational films that deal with like institutions and fiction films like The Street or The Last Laugh, in which like disability and bodily vulnerability are thematized in relation to like the modern workplace, the modern urban environment. And so that's part of the book becoming more about embodiment as it progresses.
Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Sorry I was late. I had a meeting that ran over, so I'm going to give the usual caveat of I apologize if I'm asking about things that have already been discussed. So it's good to see you, Paul. I'm super excited about this book and I'm happy to be here. So as a follow-up, I guess I have two questions, and you can take or leave either of them. Kind of as a follow-up to Mary's question, I was thinking, and the way that you described in The Vortex of Traffic, in Strudel des Verkehrs, the street is also not a place for chatty women. because they get in the way too. But women are fine on the sidewalk where there's this kind of sexual commerce going on. So asking you to talk a little bit about gender and sexuality in the context of hygiene. And then also just a little bit about kind of a methodological approach to the question of hygiene, that hearing you talk out loud about texts and kind of the boundaries of texts or genres, the Kulturfilme being a hybrid genre between fiction and nonfiction, or authorship, and even having to divide a book into specific chapters and choose whether you're going to have a chapter about an author or a chapter about, so how maybe thinking about hygiene helped you think about how to conceptualize a book of a, or a project of a book, of a scale of a book. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for coming, Sarah. It's great to see you too. Yes, you're exactly right about the kind of gendering of public space in the traffic film, and that's relevant for the films that I deal with that take place in the domestic sphere as well. So I look at one that deals with kind of hygiene of the home, and then this film about the Frankfurt kitchen that kind of shows off this new kitchen design. It was part of the new Frankfurt architectural project. And so, like, as I said, with regard to disability, that these films that are staging environmental order are also then forced to stage a kind of social order, a vision of the way those two intersect. And this order is also patriarchal, right? And so it envisions, like, when you're thinking about the hygiene of the home, it invests the housewife with a certain authority, like on the one hand, as the one who's like responsible for controlling the environment, but obviously like places her there and defines that as the space where she is supposed to be, and so there is this kind of very fundamental kind of conservatism to the hygienic imagination of environments that always have a kind of implicit social order that come along with them, that is then becomes visible when looking at how they're represented, in these kind of like educational films. And so it's right. It's a patriarchal order, and it is an ableist order, right? It's an order that centers the able body. And you had another question about methodology. Yeah, it was difficult in some ways, right? Like I could have written a chapter about Murnau per se, or organize it around like that kind of like filmic authorship. But I tried to think about it in terms of like what kind of encounter is happening here between cinema and hygiene, sort of like at what like level is the encounter happening, and so, or kind of what kind of spatial dimension is it invoking, right? And so I focus on the space of the theater, and then attempts to use it as an educational tool, and then I look at anti-hygiene from a kind of, or like resistance to hygiene from from Faust, like particulate matter, and then thinking about the way these films stage bodies that are out of place, and thinking about disability and aging, and then finally this like kind of political critique that's articulated. And so I don't know if it's perfect, but it was at least a way for me of trying to organize the material into something approaching like a development.
Does anyone else have any questions or anything in the chat right now? Yeah, I was going to ask actually a question about the this idea of like phantasmagoria as the actual Magic Lantern show versus like the kind of Benjaminian conception of that. And because you start the very beginning of the book starts with this greenhouse where like the first film shown in Germany was in the greenhouse, which immediately kind of had me thinking about kind of cast iron structures and this idea of bringing the outside in as you mentioned earlier, as a kind of this kind of phantasmagorical effect, and whether that has any kind of influence in your thinking. And in a slight kind of tangent to that would be that the idea of the cinema space as being a kind of place for the working class to be kind of for them to be healthy so that they can work, as also being this kind of culture industry argument, and whether in some way there's a lot of kind of vindication or there's a lot of kind of corroboration of certain kind of critical theory related ideas that kind of come out of this very different analysis. Yeah, that's kind of two questions in one.
It's a kind of different idea, like a kind of you're thinking of the kind of the phantasmagoria of like the world of the consumer, the kind of image of like the consumer paradise and the kind of like illusions that like are or the kind of like the kind of phantasmagoria of the consumer world. I mean, I think like with regard to some of these films that are like envisioning the ordered environment, that they're kind of like sleight of hand, and this idea that like we can solve society, or we can organize society if we just sort of put everything in its right place, right? As long as people like obey the rules of the road, as long as we keep the dust off the off the floor, then that is what constitutes a kind of ordered society, which is, and so there's this kind of like ideological slippage that these films kind of appeal to, right? Is if we can just make everything correct, then things will be fine. Obviously, like that's a total illusion, and the reason that environments were disordered in after industrialization is because of the way industrial society was arranged politically, and the sort of way the profit motive leads to the destruction of certain kinds of environments and so on and so on. So like you can't just fix that by like cleaning your kitchen or something, right? In terms of the corroboration of a kind of like culture industry understanding of cinema, I would say it's a bit more messy, actually. That like, I don't mean the book to be a kind of like story about how cinema was like tamed by hygiene or something. Just the very fact of its like darkness is a kind of irking fact for the ideal, the kind of hygienic ideal, which was about like making sure environments were visible. In order to like order something, you have to be able to see it. And movie, like the theater environment was like always a little excessive. It could not be, you couldn't be fully surveilled. Like things were happening there that could not be observed, right? And so it always kind of exceeded that like hygienic impulse. And I think similarly in terms of film aesthetics, right? That the aesthetics of film always open on to certain kinds of like resistance to order that I try to like bring out in some of those chapters, that it's not just a kind of like taming of cinema that happens, but that each kind of, you could conceive it more dialectically, I think in saying that like the kinds of hygienic ordering that like these experts wanted to impose themselves define new lines of transgression and resistance that then in turn, get reacted to in different ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you mentioned Randall Haller's like conception of or kind of revision of the apparatus, which I think contains that idea as well, that the very forces that try to order kind of become a kind of crucible for transgression and disorder as well. And then of course in the book there's this kind of journey. Indeed. So if there are no burning questions, or if anyone has anything left to say, feel free to chime in or yeah, raise a hand. But otherwise, we can leave it there and thank Paul for joining us. It's been yeah, a really interesting discussion, and it's really exciting for you to share like some glimpses into the book, and hopefully people can access that as soon as possible. We've put the discount codes in the chat, have we? They're kind of disseminated. So yeah, and also thank you to everyone for coming. As I said at the beginning, it's a hot, busy time of year, wherever you may be in the world. So thank you so much for coming. Before we go, Molly, do you want to say something about our next event?
Yeah, so obviously we've now had 2 events and they've both gone really well and been really successful, and we're really, as Lawrence already said, really grateful to Paul for sharing his exciting research today. We have got another event coming up in August, I believe. I think it's the 24th. We will send round email invitations, and that's going to be more of a research paper format, and we're hosting Javier Samper-Vendrell, and he's going to be talking a little bit about Emile and the detectives. I think he's going to send an abstract soon, so I can send that round. And also just a general plug, if anybody else is interested in presenting or wants to share some publication news, then please do get in touch. It is not only an invite only scenario. We're always happy to share with everyone. The question in the chat about signing up to a mailing list, the mailing list is sort of defunct in somewhat. I would suggest, if you can, follow on social media, or if you drop us an email at Weimar Film Network at warwick.ac.uk, I'll put it in the chat before we go, then we can get in touch and we'll let you know of events that are coming up. But other than that, I think that's all the news, and just a big thank you to Paul and to Lawrence for hosting the chat, and everyone for coming. It's really great to have this sense of community. So hopefully we'll see you all soon.
Thank you for organizing, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Maybe, I don't know if you want to stay on. I always feel like if you're the host and you end it, like I don't want to end it before, you usually don't want to cut people off. But yeah, people. No, yeah, just thank you guys, and I look forward to your upcoming events. Okay, amazing. Yeah, thank you so much thank you for joining us, and congratulations. Thank you. Okay. Bye. Okay, I'll now end the call.
Oh, just before you do, will be a post. We've recorded it, so it's going to be on YouTube. So we'll send you. I can send you an email link so you can watch it back. Yeah. Oh, exactly. Well, I'll stop the recording now because I forgot to.